It isn't until about the 12-minute mark of its 90-minute runtime that Mad Max formally introduces us to its titular hero. Up until that point, the audience is given only short, incomplete glimpses, accompanied by an ominous sting of music, interspersed between a breakneck car chase across the Australian outback. Not only does it lend our hero an air of mystique that will end up carrying over into subsequent films, but in keeping Max at the periphery, at least at first, it goes a long way to telling the audience who this guy is and what his role is in the world. Max is the nuclear option. He's the guy you call in when the shit really hits the fan. He's the only guy crazy enough to drive straight towards certain doom, and he's the only guy capable enough to come out the other side again, still intact. Filmed on a budget of around $400,000 dues, Mad Max went on to earn $100 million at the box office, making it the most profitable film of all time until the release of the Blair Witch Project 20 years later. One need look no further than the American International Pictures logo to see the franchise's humble beginnings, and indeed there's a certain low-budget scrappiness to the original Mad Max that has less in common with the grand dystopian fiction we're all familiar with today than it does the B-movie biker pictures of decades prior. Watching Toe Cutter and his crew reminded me of something like The Wild One with Marlon Brando or The Damned starring Oliver Reed.
Animals dressed as human beings. Smash, smash, smash.
There you are, minding your own business in your quaint little town, when the next thing you know, some psycho with main character syndrome rides in with his pals and turns the whole place upside down. It's interesting that, in thinking about the Mad Max films, the images that probably most come to mind, that being hulking leather daddies battling in demonic-looking cars across the desert, are from the sequels. Probably the main reason for that is that the supposed post-apocalypse of the original isn't nearly as fleshed out as in later films. Sure, everybody's a bit eccentric, maybe a bit too aggressive, but for all I know, this could just be another day in Australia. That bit of text at the beginning about the film taking place a few years from now seems put there as almost an afterthought, a last-minute caveat to try and add context to the outlandish characters and situations, rather than them springing from any sort of preconceived world building. Contrast how Max treats gasoline in the first film versus how he treats it in the second.
Psychopathic, you know?
The chain in those handcuffs is high tensile steel.
That scene where Max gives the guy the option to saw off his own foot is classic, by the way. If the beginning of the film is a memorable enough introduction to the character, the final scene really cements Max as a classic action protagonist. Now, the parallel between these two scenes could be intentional, showing the regression from post-apocalypse to post-post-apocalypse. You could also say that Max being blinded by revenge probably has something to do with it, but the fact remains, when most people think dystopia, they probably think scarcity. They think of civilization hanging on by a thread. They probably don't think of getting dressed up and going on vacation with a wife and kid. That's another way in which the original Mad Max sticks out from the sequels, is that here Max is grounded by a backstory. Max has a hardly dystopian home life. He's got a loving wife who serenades him on the saxophone. They've got a toddler, a nice house. In subsequent films, Max takes on a more mythic man-with-no-name style archetype, where in the original he's motivated first by duty, then by revenge. In subsequent films, he's more of the wandering samurai, drifting from place to place and getting embroiled in conflicts that really have nothing to do with him, but which he reluctantly takes on out of mostly circumstance, but also the innate goodness and sense of heroism still buried under his brooding leather-clad exterior. In a lot of ways, the original Mad Max seems more like a prequel than the first of a franchise, more like what The Hobbit is to The Lord of the Rings. At the same time, the original introduces many elements which would end up becoming foundational to the series. The black leather, the increasingly bombastic villains. The main one, though, is the blistering automotive destruction. Here we see some of the benefits of a smaller, scrappier production in that you get the sense there wasn't a ton of oversight with some of the stunts. In an era dominated by weightless CGI and petty concerns like safety, it's refreshing to go back to a film where it looks like they literally just bashed two hunks of metal together as hard as they could. A clever use of editing also goes a long way to suggest more than what's actually happening on screen. People often criticize the quick cuts and rapid-fire editing of, say, a Michael Bay film, but in Mad Max you have a similar style of action composition that actually works, that's similarly frenetic but which doesn't sacrifice clarity. Consider this shot of a spinning road sign in the opening chase scene. The pursuit officers are chasing down the bad guy, Knight Rider. The one leans out of the window, fires his gun at Knight Rider, but misses and hits the sign instead. The first thing this spinning road sign does is it adds clarity. This is how we know the officer has missed his shot. Note that we never actually see the gun being fired. There's no muzzle flash, no squib. It's just a sound effect and then the road sign. You can probably chalk this up to ingenuity born of a limited budget. The point is, does the viewer notice it? Do they miss the muzzle flash or the squib? Is their immersion broken any, or is the action any less clear? I don't think so, no. So the spinning road sign gives the sequence clarity, but it also establishes a subtle sort of Looney Tunes component to the way George Miller directs action. More realistically, that sign would have had a chunk blown out of it. It would have fallen over maybe, but instead it spins around in completely improbable fashion. The physics of Mad Max, while grounded and visceral, are occasionally just a little bit off. In that same chase sequence, and then later in the one at the end, both Knight Rider and Toe Cutter's eyes bulge out of their heads in cartoonish fashion right before they meet their makers. Okay, I think that's about all I got for the original Mad Max. Depending on how this one goes, I was thinking of doing each film in the series in the lead up to the new Furiosa spin-off prequel thing. Should I do that? Should I talk about every Mad Max film? I'm already watching them. I'm already Mad Max maxing. Let me know what you think. Okay, goodbye.